Yep, let's do it.
All right.
Actually, wait a minute. I'm just going to have a sip of water.
God fucking damn it. Absolute fucking pillock.
Bell end.
I didn't say bell end. I said pillock.
I know. I was just responding with other
iconic
British insults.
Phil, is it a shame that you just can't forget how exceedingly British you are when you're talking to me? It must be like...
I can't... To be fair, I am, like, more British than most people. Even most British people.
Okay, all right.
I'm floppy-haired and skinny and slightly awkward, so...
And very dry.
Yeah.
Not your sense of humor, I mean your skin. You're very dry.
Oh, yeah. Like, just flaky.
Just peeling constantly. Oh.
Snaggletooth and duplicitous.
Man, that's quite a phrase. Snaggletooth and duplicitous is a good combination. Yeah. I think it's just the forgivable version of every like white person's innate compulsion to just go and touch black people's hair. This is the okay version of that. I can just constantly mention that you're different from me. It makes me feel more comfortable.
Who said it was okay?
Well,
what are you assuming, Connor?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Son of a bitch.
I'm so sorry. Can I touch your stringy hair, please, sir? All right, let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. Lou Rawls is out this week, but with me is Phil McKenzie, as you were expecting, and I hope, praying, that Phil McKenzie would be here to talk to you. UFC 230 was last weekend, and that is largely what we're going to concern ourselves with today. I think we're going to be talking about that first, because surely, even though it did get a shockingly low sort of engagement and statistics based on what I saw from people reading articles and watching videos, et cetera, surely that's more interesting to you folks than next week's card, even though next week's card is, as you said, Phil, pretty much what a Fight Night card should be and looks pretty damn compelling. So today's show will probably end up being split in two, more or less. We're going to get to the results of UFC 230 first, and then in the latter half of the show, we're going to spend our time looking forward to the violence scheduled to take place in Denver, Colorado, at the Pepsi Center. Great. All right. So, Phil, UFC 230 was P good.
It was pretty damn good.
All right. I'm glad that you did not fixate on me saying P good. Please move on.
Yeah, this was this ended up being just a good, fun card with a lot of different flavors to it. I think that's one of the important things especially for the main card. It's important to have a lot of different stuff happening. I think, the classic good, the classic amazing UFC card is, I think it's 185, McGregor Mendes.
Sure. And
you just have a ton of different outcomes. There's wars, there's just crazy knockouts. There's a kind of cultural zeitgeist moment when McGregor finally wins his first UFC belt. It's got Lawler McDonald too.
Okay, I was going to ask. It also had the greatest fight of all time. So
yeah. And this one had it had a ton of things you'd want to see. It had a prospect showing really coming into his own in a way even more impressive than most of us possibly could have thought. It had a decent, another decent prospect win. It had a crazy upset. Mm-hmm. It had an absolute war. And then, the main event, perhaps somewhat expected, but it just had, a very, very good fighter, one of the best in his weight class, one of the best of all time, just showing why he's that good.
Yeah. None of the very few fights that we didn't expect to be that good were disappointingly bad or anything. And at least one or two of them were far more compelling and interesting than we expected. And meanwhile, the bulk of the card was made up of very good matchups, and they were very good to watch. It was a pleasant time. Even though I did miss a big chunk of it. In fact, I didn't get to see Israel Adesanya's win until the day after. I'm ashamed to say.
You sicken me.
Yeah, I know. Man. But should we talk about it? Should we talk about the fights? I mean, how about the main event, Phil? Help me move on from my existential dread. Daniel Cormier, Derek Lewis. I believe the word you used to describe this performance just a few minutes ago was mostly academic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like we said, Cormier is something of the style nightmare matchup for Derek Lewis.
What if all these guys who feel that they absolutely have to take you down could actually wrestle?
Yeah. So, I mean, there were a couple of interesting things. Like early, I remember, like just when the fight was starting, I was suddenly like, oh yeah, left kicks.
Yup.
Daniel Cormier really isn't that good against, and you know, he did his classic thing of sort of leaning and jerking away from them and eating both of them relatively cleanly, and you know that maybe gave you a brief period of hope, and then he just got a completely effortless single leg, and that was sort of it.
Yeah.
Is that he didn't have to go for big flashy high crotch takedowns. He didn't have to go for anything insane. It was just single legs and mat returns and a very nice ankle pick, and I think someone that, you know, we won't mention had the good take on it that Lewis was probably just going to get submitted in this fight, because he does tend to just roll over to all fours and stand up out of takedowns, and Cormier is a pretty good rear naked choke artist. So I think that person, like I said, we won't mention Zane Simon because we're not here to promote other analysts.
Yeah, a certain handsome film buff from Alaska said that Daniel Cormier would probably get Derek Lewis to give up his back and get choked out. That's as far as we'll go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was what happened. Daniel Cormier is really good, and Derek Lewis is really strong, and that wasn't enough.
Yep. And Daniel Cormier is officially, by the way, your dad, because as he said after the fight, he threw out his back sneezing the week of the fight, or like the night before. He sneezed and threw his back out.
That is amazing.
And was in terrible, terrible pain and was thinking of pulling out of the fight, but apparently got some massages and was feeling good enough to go ahead with it. So 2 men with terrible back problems had a considerably predictable fight in the main event of UFC 230. Yeah, I do want to say, like, there were a couple moments where it seemed like Derek had the right idea, like even after the hard first round. He didn't look that tired after all that getting out wrestled, which is pretty typical impressive stuff from Derek Lewis, that you do have to work really, really hard to manhandle him and toss him around and keep him down. And it doesn't take that much effort for him to just sort of slowly, sleepily drift through positions until he eventually gets back to his feet. And then the second round opened up. He was coming out with those left kicks, playing it off of the right hand, sort of making Cormier choose between his 2 favorite tactics of dipping all the way over to his right side or leaning all the way back past his feet. A couple of shots came real close, but Derek Lewis, as I've said before, up to this point, he's needed heavyweight as much as it has needed him. And Daniel Cormier is not like most heavyweights. He's a really, really good wrestler, as it turns out. And it sort of shows the limitations of a style built on doing very little, so that the little you do, you can do with all of your power behind it. Like, what happens if you don't land anything?
And it's worth remembering, like, AKA doesn't just teach people to be very good wrestlers. It teaches them to be very good submission grapplers as well.
Yes. Yeah. And that was a big part of the predictions as well, was Cormier is also by far going to be the best top player, probably the best ground and pound and the best submissions that Lewis has had to face ever. So,
yep. So this was basically the dad at the barbecue subduing the unruly uncle with no filter after he has a few too many beers. It's like, I don't want to hurt you too much, and I did my back in.
Somehow a game of spades turned into a massive heated argument, and this is what happened. Yeah. You mentioned that ankle pick though from DC. That was legit. I love DC's wrestling transitions. Anytime I get to see like the crazy foot sweep against Dan Henderson, there's always these little highlight moments of clever adaptive wrestling technique, and the way that's how you find a way around Derek Lewis's technique. Because what happened? DC snapped him down. He was hanging his entire body weight off of Derek Lewis's head and arm. And yet Derek Lewis was still getting up onto his hands and knees and resisting. And DC, you could tell, was really struggling to pull him down any further. So he just switched to the ankle pick and tipped his big ass over. And, finished him. It was an impressive performance from DC. Not exactly unpredictable, but still a reminder of why he is who he is. So what else? The co-main event may have been one of the biggest highlights of the night. We predicted that this, like all of the fights between top 5 UFC middleweights have been in the past few years, to be something of a brutal war of attrition. And boy, was it, my friend. It was absolutely brutal. What are your thoughts?
Wow. Yeah, this was one of the most physically, punishing fights to watch in this division that we've seen for quite some time. I mean, it's up there with Romero, Bobby Knuckles 2, which is, I think, the consensus best middleweight fight of all time and the front runner for fight of the year.
Yeah.
But it was just kind of two guys. In some ways, we defined this as being two fighters who want to come forward, and in that kind of fight, it seems sort of inevitable that this is going to happen. Is that they're just going to meet in the center, and when they're both tough and skilled and determined enough, both kind of with their back against the wall, and really both facing the prospect of being kicked out of title contention somewhat permanently, considering that they're both old and relatively injury ridden.
Right.
That this might be their last chance. Chris Weidman basically fighting at home, or close to it.
He hasn't gotten a chance not to, I don't think, since the UFC first came to New York. He's fought there every single time.
Yeah, and I thought it was a very impressive fight. I was just really impressed by both men. I think Chris Weidman showed a very good understanding of how he should be fighting Jacare. Mm-hmm. And you realized when they got in the cage that he is, I realized more so when they got in the cage, he is not only taller, but obviously he's much longer than Jacare. And he maximized a lot of that by moving quite a lot, more than we've seen from him, and just by throwing a lot of shots and a lot of probing light shots. He just spattered in volume from range, and it worked really well. And I think partially this is because Weidman has always been someone who's been very good at knowing where people are from an offensive standpoint. He's very good at corralling people in a certain direction, driving them with shots, and him attacking with probing shots. It helped that out a lot. And so I think the early going in the fight, you saw this had been well trained. This is a really good adaptation for who Chris Weidman is.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad you brought that up, because it was sort of like the other thing we like to say about I say we. This is your point that I've just stolen, as I have so many of your points. Is that Weidman Rockhold 1 was both guys showed up and looked way worse than we expected, and that's another thing that I was half expecting, is that these great, phenomenal athletes get in there, and in the same way that two grapplers often match up to have a crappy kickboxing match, this was almost that, except it was not crappy. In that same way, like, it seems like these top 5 middleweights also have a weird tendency to sort of like cancel each other's abilities out. And this was the opposite of Rockhold Weidman, I think. Like, I think both guys got a chance to show what really makes them special as fighters, some of their less celebrated skills. I think it's clear to me Weidman has been putting in work on his boxing technique and becoming a more flexible, adaptable striker. We saw head movement in the Gastelum fight like this. We've seen more evasive footwork. I still don't think he's really that comfortable with it. Like, at a certain point in this fight, what he needed to be able to do was to throw those light punches in order to set up evasive movement. He needed to be able to stick and move. And that is still something I don't think he quite gets. You know, like, he's sticking, but his feet are planted because he's waiting for you to react in such a way that he can hit you or take you down while you're reacting. Not in such a way that he can move out of the way and make you miss like a raging bull. And so
yeah, his movement was all about establishing distance. Yeah. It was about maintaining the spot where he could throw punches from. It wasn't about, so he would move out, throw punches, move out, but he couldn't, he is not any kind of counterpuncher. He can't punch and move without being, it's like artillery that he has to move, set and fire, move, set and fire. He can't just move, he can't, let alone move and fire, at once. He can't, blend the two in any real way. Yeah.
Even if the fundamentals are all generally pretty darn good, and always have been with Weidman. Like, he's always had a good, stable stance and a nice jab and been able to put his punches together very fluidly. It's just, sort of, a fight feel kind of problem built into his style. And for Jacare's part, counterpunching and pressure did end up being huge problems, which I think you were pretty big on that. I mean, you were basically saying, like, as this goes on, Jacare's counterpunching can be a really huge problem for Weidman's, like, porous defense. And because,
Yeah, so I think, like, one of the dynamics that I think I touched on about the Rockhold fight was that, the Rockhold fight was similar. The Rockhold Weidman fight was similar in that it was two guys who really need to come forward. Neither of them particularly strong defensively, but Rockhold was someone who can fight moving backwards. He's so in these, and that was a big advantage for him. Is that when Weidman was able to take his turn, it still wasn't a safety zone for him.
Yeah,
and so the question wasn't who's better at pushing the other guy back, because in this case, the answer was Weidman. He was longer, and he was longer and threw more volume and just could inflict damage from outside. The question was, who can survive moving backwards? Mm-hmm. And the answer was Jacare, because Jacare has head movement.
Yep.
He was blocking strikes. He is defensively much better. As a puncher, he was much more one note than Weidman was. And to
the Rockhold comparison, it's not as if Rockhold's a good fighter off the back foot. You mentioned that already, but the fact that Jacare, like, a big part of it was that Rockhold could counter, and Jacare certainly can counter better and more reliably than Rockhold. And that's a big deal, is at the very least, are you still threatening while moving backwards? That's very helpful when your goal is to survive retreating more than the other guy.
Yeah, but it also meant that when it was Jacare, like many fighters, realized after a while that he just needed to push Weidman backwards.
Yep.
And I think, and this was awesome to see, because to me it was just incredibly consonant with who Jacare is as a person, that he did it with two punches. And he did it with that liver shot and that overhand. And it was just awesome to me that these two punches basically meet in the center, and that he is, Jacare, he is the alligator. He was throwing, and he basically crushed Weidman between these two, between those two shots. This was essentially his clapping hands, jaws thing that he does. He just did it with punches.
That's a great read. Yeah, that's a great read on having an up-down trajectory of attack in a combination is like a classic staple boxing technique. There's a reason people do it. If you can hit somebody from one angle coming up and the other angle coming down from the side, it's very difficult to consistently avoid both. but I love thinking of that as the fucking gator chomp. That is great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so and also credit to him, he realized, what he had to do, which was just to push in past Weidman's shots. And he's never thrown, he's always had a lovely body shot, but he's never thrown quite that many.
Yeah.
He's never been quite as dedicated to just winning a war of attrition with someone.
Yeah.
And it was amazing to see. It was amazing to see his heart again. We've seen so much of Jacaré's heart, and I was just incredibly impressed by his ability to, especially when I thought, this guy is probably physically on the way out. He's about to be 39 years old. He's clearly not in his physical prime anymore. Just deciding, I'm going to win this fight by wading forward and pushing this guy back. No matter what the fuck happens, I know I can push him back, and then just doing it.
Yeah. We shouldn't have needed another reminder, right? Like we've seen the Gastelum fight recently. We saw the fight with Romero where Jacare got obliterated near the end of the first round, but still fought his way back into the point that he might have won it. But, because I think he's such a big dominance, athlete, people don't tend to give those kinds of, they seem like destroyers, so they don't get credit when they have tremendous courage. This was a very courageous performance from Jacare, for sure. And similar to the Brunson knockout, the final, 20 seconds of the fight, are terrifying. I respect Jacaré's heart. Each performance makes me like and root for him more. But also, when he, Weidman was doing well at the start of the third round, and then Jacare just started slipping punches. Suddenly, it was like this serpentine speed. He was slipping and countering with huge shots, and Weidman just started. You could just tell, 20 seconds before the knockout came, Weidman was buckling in a way that Jacare hadn't under the previous pressure of Weidman. So it was a great little last-minute turnaround in a fight that was otherwise very back and forth anyway. And hell yeah, Jacare. What about Weidman? Any thoughts before we move on, just real quickly? Does this say anything to you, this fight? Does it seem to beg anything different for him in the future, or is it just, another top 5 middleweight clash?
So I think the suggestion people have said is David Branch, which is probably seems about right. But sure. I think we've seen the issue. This is the Weidman has gotten better at the things that he's good at from a technical standpoint.
Yeah.
He's probably not physically there as much as he used to be, but he is still almost exactly as bad at the things that he's bad at. Meaning, if you can essentially find some way to force him onto the defensive, or to force him into taking ugly shots, or he's in trouble.
Yep. Anything reactive. Even going back to his first Anderson Silva fight, it was all about his preparation mentally was all about basically not reacting to what was in front of him and solely focusing on making his fight happen. And that continues to be sort of the through line in his career. Yeah, I agree. It is tough though to see. It's fighting. And we were saying basically the same thing about Jacare before this. So both guys, again, were in a very similar position coming into this matchup. But it is tough to look at Weidman's record and see just 4 of his last 5, he lost by knockout.
Yep.
He was dropped really hard in the one of those that he won. And again, you have to go back to 2013, his second win over Anderson Silva, to see a Weidman fight in which he wasn't notably hurt by his opponent. So
it's also notable that he got dropped really bad early in the Gastelum fight and went on to win it. And in all of his other ones, he was doing pretty well.
Yeah.
He generally tended to pick up the first round. In all of his other ones, he was doing pretty well, and then just got fucked up.
Yeah, that's
got finished. That's got to be kind of brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of finishes, we have to shout out Dan Miragliotta's sickening stoppage.
Oh,
what the fuck?
Oh, absolutely. Another thing that makes you like Jacare, at least.
Yep.
Jacare was outraged, insisting that Dan Miragliotta pay attention as he was throwing his hands wide. What the fuck are you doing? Yeah. Weidman rolled over after being knocked down he rolled over his front half.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. Sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like. And in return, you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you.
Yeah, someone on Twitter, I can't remember who it was, said
no amount is too small.
Weidman was not going for a takedown. He was just trying to grab on
and find how you can help out. The only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching.
That's what he was going.
Now let's get back to.
He was barely fighting on instant. Welcome back. So yeah, terrible stoppage. Tan Dan, you should be ashamed.
And welcome back to Heavy Hands.
That brings us to
we
a break.
Are continuing to move
when we
on
come back.
UFC
we're going to get into
again.
The rest
we will
of what
be,
interested us.
This like it's a
UFC 230,
like
namely
before, right?
that's Jared Cannonier's big upset
still,
win over David
rest
Branch.
Assured, we're going to be talking about next
one of the advantages of going down in weight, as you said. But before that, we're going to talk about Izzy Adesanya's
the last style bender,
second or third breakout win.
As I said,
in an incredible breakout year.
It's almost
Derek Brunson.
It's almost,
and we're also going to look at the
Adesanya's first UFC
fight was between Lando Venata
and Matt
Frivola before moving on to UFC Fight Night Denver with
Chan
Sung Jung versus Yair Rodriguez and Cerrone versus Perry and more. Derek Brunson. Very clear, very dramatic steps up in competition, and each time his performance has, not just by virtue of the increasing competition, but it definitely has to do with that, his performance has become more impressive. Which is something that you do not often see. Is somebody who gets rushed right through the ranks, picks up the skills that are lacking in their early fights as they move on to face tougher and tougher guys. And Brunson's flaws were maybe more exploitable than a guy like Brad Tavares. His flaws are more catastrophic in nature at the very least. But Brunson still, like if this were Adesanya's first UFC fight, would have been considered an absolute nightmare opponent. Someone with huge power, who's incredibly strong, and really aggressive, who is a very skilled wrestler. Like you would have assumed without second thought, oh, he's going to, why would they do that to this kickboxer? But just 3 fights into his UFC career, Adesanya expertly stuffed all of Derek Brunson's takedowns, hurt him, and then very calmly, very methodically worked his way to the finish, even like taking a big shot en route and then readjusting, defending himself, and proceeding to calmly put Derek Brunson away. It was pretty incredible to watch, I have to say.
Yeah, it was breathtaking. I mean, the thing is that, like you said, this is a completely normal, accurate progression curve, right? I mean, assuming someone gets a lot of hype and they do well,
right.
And this is, it's faster than most people would get, but it makes a lot of sense. Curve. It's a linear progression upwards. But what's more impressive is that the fights have gotten easier.
Yes.
The harder they've gotten. Is that he started off against Rob Wilkinson. It was like, he's kind of just got, clinched up and held up against the cage a lot. And then eventually, just seemed to wear Wilkinson down. Like Wilkinson basically just exhausted himself and then got picked off. And then, Marvin Vettori, again, perfectly fine, but sort of had some issues in the last round. You clearly like, is this guy really going to be a finisher at the top level? Is he, he still clearly has grappling deficiencies. Brad Tavares pretty much just had some issues early, but then mostly just shit kicked him. And then Derek Brunson, he just obliterated him.
He seemed to spend less time fighting off takedowns against the fence in this first round against Derek Brunson than he did in the first round against Rob Wilkinson. But also he destroyed him in that same round.
Yeah. I mean, and this is the thing is that this wasn't first layer takedown defense either. This wasn't just like Derek Brunson took a shot, and then Israel Adesanya just got him with some hyper athletic sprawl or just stiff armed him out of the way. And that was it. And Derek Brunson just ended up shooting at air for the entire round.
Yep.
Nothing like that. Derek Brunson, to his credit, but being Derek Brunson, this ended up killing him. But to his credit, he had a reasonable idea of what to do. He was like, I'm not going to really try setting up strikes at all against this guy. I'm not going to bum rush him, but I am just going to shoot takedowns on him.
Yep.
And to his credit, he managed to get his hands on Adesanya, and he managed to get him to, relatively compromised positions. If you'd told me beforehand, within, the first major thing that happens in this fight is Derek Brunson's going to get a body lock on Israel Adesanya by the fence.
Yep.
And specifically, when you looked at that happening and you were like, Jesus fucking Christ, Derek Brunson is way bigger than Israel Adesanya. Like, that would have heavily made me rethink who was going to win this fight.
And again, 8 months ago, that type of fight almost certainly would have gotten Derek Brunson the win, based on how much trouble it gave Adesanya when it was Rob Wilkinson doing it. 8 months ago, this would have been a winning idea.
Yep. Maybe even less than that. I mean, his takedown defense against Marvin Vettori didn't look this good.
Yeah.
I mean, multiple times Brunson was able to lock him up, get him with the body lock, and Adesanya just cross-faced him, pummeled for an underhook, turned off the cage, and got back out again.
Yep.
And the thing is that just the feints kept Brunson biting on, too scared to throw his strikes so much that it became the sort of Weidman-Romero self-fulfilling prophecy, is that he was just like, I have to get back into the clinch with this guy. Eventually I'm going to get him. Mm-hmm. I have to get there. And then he just ducked straight into that knee.
Yep. Yeah. And even like, it was clear after he first got stung by that first knee, he wasn't exactly thinking clearly, which is what happens when Derek Brunson is fighting and the fight starts. But he was clearly like, while fighting on sort of instinct and half dazed, he kept just sort of lolling forward into Adesanya's striking wheelhouse. Like, he just kept thinking, I have to get close to this guy. I have to smother him. And so he just kept walking right into the pinpoint shots that Adesanya was carefully selecting to finish him off. But still, on the point of the wrestling, because that is maybe one of the most impressive things about this. Like, Adesanya's striking is obviously in a way that very few MMA fighters' striking is. Fluid and creative and just so fast and impressive and accurate. It is an elite striking specialist, the likes of which we very, very rarely see in this sport. But the wrestling, as you said, not just the single layer, it was the angles, it was the frames, it was the little clever creative ways of creating distance while maintaining a good base and forcing the other guy to fight and fight and fight to just hold on to his threatening position. It was very much like watching Ioane and Jacek against Carla Esparza. Where she comes in there, she's tying her up, and you're like, okay, well, this is what happens. And then very quickly you realize, oh, this is not what Carla wanted from this takedown attempt. This is not going at all how she planned. And then suddenly there's a turning point, and the striker just destroys the wrestler. And, I mean, holy shit. Israel Adesanya is a prospect to care about. Absolutely. A striker, like an elite striker from a striking sport, still in his prime, in the octagon, stuffing the takedowns of Derek Brunson with ease. That's something special.
He is the prospect to care about at the moment, I would say.
Absolutely. And it's almost not even fair to call him a prospect anymore. The man is a bona fide contender in the middleweight division. So I am super hyped to see what Adesanya goes on to do next. We knew there were exploitable holes in the game of Derek Brunson. I was finally smart enough to pick Adesanya based on the improvements he had been making. And I'm glad we did, because he looked sensational, more sensational than ever. So
I mean, what do you think about his? What do you think about his next chance? Who he's fighting next? Because a lot of people are saying Jacare.
Yeah, that's the tough thing, right? Middleweight, somewhat similar situation to some of the other sort of thin or striated divisions. Like, there is still a big difference between Derek Brunson and the real top 5 core talent, right? Like, Derek Brunson has his glaring flaws. But the likes of Jacare, Chris Weidman, I saw other people suggesting Adesanya Rockhold. I mean, I would basically watch him fight any of them. I would also watch him eat another lower ranked contender or something. You know, I wouldn't mind that at all. Just to let him really build up to it. But Adesanya, oh man, I mean,
I might have to pick Adesanya over Jacare.
Yeah, that's the big test, right? It's like it's very much like, will we see the Whittaker fight again?
Yeah,
Jacare's fight with Whittaker or not? We know it can be done. It's essentially, will Adesanya end up looking more like Mousasi or Whittaker? And it's starting to look like he might be another Whittaker. I think I might agree. I think he might be favored over Jacare. And then, goddamn, imagine a fight between Whittaker and Adesanya. Holy fuck. That is something. All right. I'm sweating. I have to towel myself down. So let's move on. But yeah, Israel Adesanya is the real deal, and he is worth your time, no doubt. Let's cover probably the last one we're going to talk about in any kind of depth, and we'll have to do this fairly quickly. But Matt Frevola and Lando Venata were the featured Fight Pass prelim. I was complaining last week on the Vivisection about this fight because Lando Venata, like Mike Perry, like all really good, reliable, fun action fighters in the UFC, is not being treated very kindly by the matchmakers of the UFC. And I understand your compulsion as a matchmaker is to make exciting fights. And that's absolutely justifiable. Because that's your job. It's what the fans want to see. It's what, with very few exceptions, the fighters want to provide, are exciting fights. But Lando Venata has a problem at this point. You know, like, we knew already before this fight, which is why I was complaining. He can't not have an exciting fight. And the trouble with exciting fights is that they're not exciting when you're dominating. They're exciting when you seem to be dominating one moment, and then you're getting smashed the next. And this was maybe, like, one of the strongest examples of that, where Venata was in huge, huge trouble at points and just steaming ahead, doing tremendous work at others. But the worry was that even if, I know Matt Frevola is a step down in competition, yada, 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 people don't understand when I say this about Mike Perry's opponent either. I'm reminded of Mike Perry versus Max Griffin, and people are like, well, he should be able to beat Max Griffin. If he can't, it's a problem, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, look, Venata's had nothing but tough fights. He hasn't gotten a win in his last 3. If he can't put Frevola out quickly, it is absolutely going to be a war. And much as was the case with Griffin against Mike Perry, not only was it a war, but it was a war in which the guy everyone was counting out showed up looking better than ever. Matt Frevola looked sensational. Lando Venata looked like a struggling version of Lando Venata, and Frevola, you know, yeah, I don't think anyone would have been upset, honestly, if Frevola had gotten the win here. It was a very close fight, but nobody saw Frevola getting a draw out of Venata, but Venata just couldn't get away from it.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we saw from Venata looked to me like, it looked very much like someone trying out a new style.
Yes.
And because we saw him, at least in that first round, we saw him fighting as a much more conventional kickboxer. Because Rogan was saying that you can see a silhouette of Venata and, you know exactly who you're looking at, right? And that was true, but I was also thinking...
Has Rogan ever said that about any other fighters?
Yeah, he must have done.
Is that a pat? That can't be a pat phrase of his. Anyway, go on.
But you can say that, but also you could tell that like something was off from his normal style. If you think, like, remember that the Tony Ferguson fight, right?
Yeah.
You remember Venata kind of hopping around and switching stances and doing all that kind of back and forth, shifting under things. That was gone.
Yep.
Not there at all. And his general style, is based around this lead. It's based around his kind of lead leg, right? He's got this hopping style, where he would lift it up and he would either come down with like he would come forward with like a right hook or something, or he would put it down and then spin with something, or he would just bring it down with as a stomp kick. And none of that was there. He just kind of came out there and stood there like he was waiting for Frevola to do something dumb, and that he was going to counter. But then he didn't seem to have the necessary head movement, or He didn't seem to have the necessary head movement or defense in any kind of way to actually make that happen.
Yeah, he was trying to be more controlled. He was trying to pick his shots and fight at a slower pace. But quite ironically, he was not groovy at all. You know, like there was no flow, no rhythm, no relaxation to his style. And I think, like, looking back, that's always been a bit of one of Lando's struggles, is that, like, until the fight is a messy, brutal war, he can't really start flowing and feeling it. He does have this sort of stiff. We've often accused on this show Lando of, like, you know, taking pictures after he throws his strikes. And he does that before he throws his strikes too. It does always feel like he's sort of like posing, setting up, and then he's going to let go. And it doesn't feel fluid or natural. But it was especially noticeable here that basically he hit a point in this fight where he decided, well, I got to be old Lando because he was getting hurt. I mean, he hurt Frevola in the first round, but then Frevola won the first round despite getting knocked down with a head kick because he put so much damage on Venata after that. Was basically hurting him with, like, every shot he landed clean on the chin over and over. And it wasn't until Venata had gone through that he was able to sort of look comfortable. But that was the problem. It's like there are problems with Venata's style, but the matchmaking is an issue as well. Like, it has to be said that a big part of the reason Venata can't not have a war with whoever he fights is that he has yet to fight an opponent who will not give him a war at the first opportunity. So, like,
I mean, fundamentally it is the Weidman problem, is that he is all offense and no defense.
Yes. Yeah.
And if he gets pushed backwards, he's just in serious trouble. Even more so, like, because his wackiness did some, you know, his wackiness made for defense. You know, there's that famous kind of, sequence of him just dipping and dodging a whole bunch of Ferguson strikes, right? None of that in this fight.
No.
Even if he was doing, like, because the thing is that his defense before was somewhat rote, in that you didn't really get the impression that he was dipping and diving because he was looking for specific strikes to avoid. You got the impression that he was doing it because he thought it looked cool.
Well, yeah. And also it was rote in the sense.
But this time it looked like he was trying to use defense and just had no idea how.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, it could still work out for him at his new team. Like, it's tough when you get the same exact kind of fight you've been having, the same sort of challenge right after you move to a new camp. There's always an adjustment period. But, yeah, man, can't Lando fight somebody boring just once? Just let him have a boring fight so he can feel okay about himself, you know, because I want to see more Lando Venata. And you don't get the best out of Lando Venata by just burning him out as quickly as possible. So,
well, we're going to talk about guys who are all offense and no defense, as well as guys who only get to fight other people in huge wars in the next segment, I guess. But we've got one more. Did we have one more to cover?
Yeah, if we just want to give a real brief shout out, basically, to the fact that Shane Burgos is awesome and Kurt Holobaugh, sort of in the same way as David Branch, is just very unfortunate. As a very good fighter who just keeps. I mean, shit, his last fight was a goddamn barn burner as well, his last UFC fight. They've been performances that I hope will encourage the UFC to keep him around, but this one was particularly disappointing, I'm sure. Knocks Shane Burgos down, big left hook, drops him, and then instantly gets armbarred.
Yeah. So Holobaugh is increasingly just like he's a pretty nuanced boxer, I think. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about Burgos is that he is joyously willing to get drawn into layers because he just loves that shit.
Yep.
And even when it's, he's a guy who's willing to dive into the deep end of the pool, even though he's not quite ready to swim there.
Yeah.
And that's, in some ways that says good things for him as long as his chin holds up. But in other ways, it's like, that's why these kind of things happen. But then again, showed tremendous, like, sprint grappling submission skills. Like, Shane Burgos is, he's one of the premier, action fighters on the come up.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah, you know you're going to be in for a great fight. And it is at least another chance to show off his incredible composure under pressure. We've seen it before with his takedown defense and all that, but it's nice to see that even after the Cater fight, he gets knocked down and he still just has a hilarious grin on his face while he's setting up the armbar that he's about to finish the fight with. He's a blast. Shane Burgos says, by the way, I like your comparison. I just want to say, as someone who has lifeguarded previously in his life, Shane Burgos is 100% that kid who goes off the diving board and remembers just before hitting the water that he doesn't know how to swim. He's that kid who's just too brave or too stupid for his own good. Sometimes it's hard to tell, but he is damn fun to watch. All right, so let's call that segment 2. When we come back, as promised, UFC Denver is yet ahead of us. Korean Zombies taking on Yair Rodriguez in the main event, and more besides. We'll get to all the stuff that we happen to care about after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. Featherweights on the docket now. Again, just a quick reminder, in case you're just tuning in, Korean Zombie Yair Rodriguez, Donald Cerrone versus Mike Perry, and Joe B-Wan Kenobi is taking on Ray Borg. It's a pretty good fight night card here, with varying levels of talent and relevance all across it, but even the ones that we did not immediately recognize their names seem to mostly be pretty good fighters. Phil, you raised the very good point. And I think this has a lot to do with why I don't think this card will suck. There's not a single fight north of welterweight on the entire lineup. And that's a good sign, because sorry, Dana, but the little guys are just more fun to watch. And this looks like an okay little guy fight night kind of card.
Yeah, we got a bunch of flyweight fights, and they're all pretty good. They're all talented guys who've had various kind of setbacks. Mm-hmm. So Mark De La Rosa, Joby Sanchez should be a ton of fun. De La Rosa sort of had an absolutely dire UFC debut and then bounced back really well in his next fight. Joby Sanchez similarly has struggled, but is still pretty much always fun. Joseph Morales, Eric Shelton, again, good stuff. And then topping it out, we've got Joseph Benavidez versus Ray Borg. The consensus number 2 flyweight in the world who beat the current champion, whether you think that he won or not, and former title challenger. So yeah, and top to bottom the card is full of good, solid, skilled action fighters. Beneil Dariush, Chaz Skelly, Davi Hamosh is fighting, who's another exciting lightweight prospect. It's well worth your time.
Happy to see Violent Bob Ross again.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Luis Peña's our main card opener, so. Yeah, it should be great. And, of course, the highlight of it all, Korean Zombie at the top. Always worth turning up to see Korean Zombie do his thing. It's weird. It feels like it's been way longer. For some reason, it feels like it's been way longer since Yair Rodriguez has lost to Frankie Edgar than it has since Korean Zombie's comeback win over Dennis Bermudez, but it's been almost exactly the same amount of time for both of these guys. Neither of them has fought since about the beginning of 2017. I think it was February for Jung and March for Rodriguez. And so it's kind of cool to have an opportunity where both guys are coming in off a layoff. Obviously one better than the other, but Yair Rodriguez didn't blow out his knee. He didn't add one more to a growing and already very long list of injuries. So promising fighter, layoff after his first big loss. Contender after a long layoff due to injury. Should be fun. What are your general thoughts on the matchup here? It's kind of a perplexing one to me. I'm not entirely sure what I think about it.
Yeah, so as you said, a lot of time off, and the only fights that we have, only recent fights that we have for reference are not very representative of what we're likely to expect.
Right.
So Frankie Edgar over Yair Rodriguez, this was just a pantsing, and sort of one that, in retrospect, perhaps we should have seen coming.
Oh, yeah. It feels that way.
Because Rodriguez is really not the world's most defensively sound fighter, and Edgar is someone who has, sparred regularly with Edson Barboza and has trained twice to fight Jose Aldo in title fights.
He's also just a fighter who comes into every single fight knowing exactly what he intends to do to you, and then he does his utmost to do it. So you don't get any time to faff around and figure out what kind of crazy fight you're going to have this time. Immediately you're fighting Frankie Edgar.
Yeah. And if after training to fight or fighting, incredibly dynamic, dangerous kickers, fighting one as comparatively unstructured as Rodriguez must have just felt like just coming home. And it looked that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And conversely, we then have Dennis Bermudez against Korean Zombie, which was Dennis Bermudez having no defense and getting knocked out in fairly short order.
Yep.
So it's very difficult to sum up, to know what we expect. And the huge layoff for Rodriguez in particular makes you think, how different does he look? How much has he changed his game? Where has he been training? How much has he... Because I know he was training at the Performance Institute, which has not historically been a great path to improvement. But, how much can we have seen him change? How much of has he been like... How much has he done the sort of Anthony Pettis thing of thinking, well, I need to work on my defensive wrestling? And how much has he seriously gone to someone who said, your defensive footwork, your counterpunching, and, much of your entire game is majorly lacking. You've been relying on athleticism way too much.
Yeah. Because I know it feels like you're really, really good at striking, and that's why Frankie Edgar took you down, because you focus too much on it. But it turns out there's a lot of little striking nuances you can add that'll make it much, much harder for people to just manhandle you however they please.
Yeah. I mean, so what did you feel like watching the tape for Rodriguez? I mean, you must have watched some of that awesome Caceres versus Rodriguez fight, right?
I still couldn't find it. It's not on Fight Pass.
I know.
It's still not there.
I know.
Fight Pass, what a great service. Really, really worth your money. And if you don't literally have to watch so many fights for a living, it's definitely still worth it for you to get it. Yeah, I don't know. I do want to mention before we get into it, it's worth pointing out that Korean Zombie himself was training to fight the aforementioned Frankie Edgar until 2 weeks ago. October 26th, I think, is when Edgar pulled out and Rodriguez stepped in. So Rodriguez, I assume, was in shape and felt good enough to take this fight. He was itching to get back, but has not had a full camp. Meanwhile, Korean Zombie is facing a drastically different kind of fighter from the one he was preparing for. So that's worth keeping in mind, I guess. As you said, it's tough to find parallel matchups that make sense for these two. To find one that really compares to how Rodriguez likes to fight in Korean Zombie's resume, I think you have to go all the way back to that loss to George Roop.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tall, weird, lanky kicker who finished him. And for Yair Rodriguez, I guess Leonardo Morales is the best comparison to the way that Korean Zombie likes to fight.
Dan Hooker, maybe?
Yeah, maybe. I guess.
I watched that fight and it was just so weird.
Yes,
because I think of Dan Hooker as being a good striker. And
that was his transition period, though. He was trying to go from being the come-forward clinch striker to being a more evasively minded fighter. He had a couple of little hiccups there where he was figuring that out. And now it's working really well for him, especially at lightweight. But that was a weird performance from him.
Yeah, because it was mostly just sort of Rodriguez sprinting around the outside, throwing crazy shit, and then just flailing.
Yeah.
Not inaccurate, but incredibly ugly counterpunches when he came in. So it's very difficult to figure out how good Rodriguez was or is, and how much he's just been extremely confident and very athletic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that seems to have carried him pretty far.
Could still get him somewhere, and Korean Zombie is not known exactly for being impossible to hit or impossible to get work done against. A lot of his fights are very back and forth. Even that 1-round battle with Dennis Bermudez, the first big shots landed were from Bermudez. Mm-hmm. But essentially, I like what it feels like we're looking at it is Rodriguez movement and kicking. The question seems to be, to me, a fairly obvious one. Can Chan Sung Jung pressure with his counter-punching based game? Can he pressure effectively enough and counter those kicks effectively enough to shut Rodriguez's movement down? And I am inclined to say yes, because I just have yet to see Rodriguez fight someone who, like, I have yet to see him fight an elite fighter who comes in with exactly the right approach and he figures out how to come back against it or circumvent that style.
Yeah. I mean, so there were a few things in that Bermudez fight which made me more confident in Korean Zombie, because he is, in general, I think, the better fighter who has beaten better competition in more significant ways. Although both of these guys' wins have aged very well. Both these guys have wins which have aged very well. Poirier for Korean Zombie, guys like Andre Fili or Dan Hooker for Rodriguez. These are good wins.
Korean Zombie's record is so weird. It feels so sparse because he's so many layoffs and everything. Anyway, go on.
But so the few things I saw from Korean Zombie in the Bermudez fight, which left me thinking, is that he did pressure quite a lot.
Yeah.
I was expecting him to, he's more of a counterpuncher lately, but he still did push Bermudez back a lot.
Yep.
He was generally initiating. When he counterpunched, he often threw combinations. This is probably fairly key against Rodriguez.
Yeah.
Rodriguez's only defense is relatively wild counterpunches or counter takedowns, which he's actually pretty good at. But I don't really see either of them being a tremendously good path to victory against Chan Sung Jung. Partially because if all Jung has to do is bait a shot with his bait one of Rodriguez's counter shots with his first strike and then counter the second one. And he also went to his grappling. Again, which shows, even against Bermudez, and even if it didn't work, he was still willing to kind of pressure into the clinch. So those things generally have me favoring Korean Zombie. Or if he can keep it in the pocket, because Rodriguez's main ability of getting out of the pocket is simply he moves out of it very quickly.
Yeah,
it's not particular footwork or anything. He'll just sprint out of it until he's gotten his range back. If Jung can just keep pressure on him consistently, I think he just ends up walking into some big shot at some point. I'm assuming Korean Zombie does tend to finish people. So, I mean, I would guess he's probably going to submit Rodriguez. In some ways it would be difficult to see happening, but he's a great top position player, great submission artist. If he can land something that hurts Rodriguez, I can see Rodriguez getting in trouble. But that Roop fight and the general kick defense is a little concerning.
Yeah, I mean, the thought of the fact that there will almost certainly be some pressure makes me feel a little better. I mean, Korean Zombie when he pressures, it tends to be sort of slow plodding, just stalking you down. So I think there might be still some
shambling.
Shambling, yes. The only way a zombie knows how to move. I think Rodriguez, that may give him still some opportunities to use lots of his dramatic, dynamic movement and set up his kicks. But at the very least, if the fight is headed in the direction of over time, Rodriguez has to move backwards more and more and more. Obviously, that's going to favor the puncher rather than the kicker. And I'm really curious. I don't even want to make any predictions for how it's going to shake out. I'm really curious to see these guys tangle on the ground if it does go there, because Rodriguez has at times looked like a sensationally creative, dangerous submission grappler. But then Frankie Edgar just wrecked him. He just shut him down. Rodriguez, it was, as you sort of alluded to, the Anthony Pettis kind of problem. He was like, I've got this crazy attack and this crazy attack. It was sorry. If the attacks aren't working and I'm not panicking in reaction to them, you are still underneath me getting smashed. So I want to see if Korean Zombie's grappling a step down from Frankie Edgar's top game, but still a very respectable ground game, is enough to similarly dominate Rodriguez on the floor. We'll see.
Yeah. It was just I think that fight was that together with Edgar's fight against, what's his face? Charles Oliveira was just an indication of what an absolute block of concrete Frankie Edgar is on top of you in this division. Yeah. Like, Jesus Christ. These guys who are just these huge, dynamic, scrambling machines, and he's just like, no, you're going to sit here. You're going to sit here and you're going to like it.
Yeah, Frankie No, I was going to try and come up with another nickname, but it wouldn't have worked. It doesn't make any sense. Let's move on quickly before anyone has any time to imagine what I might have been about to say. We'll only have a little bit of time to discuss these. A little bit of time, I say. But welterweights, Donald Cerrone and Mike Perry. That's obviously the other most compelling matchup on this card. Cerrone officially no longer with Jackson Wink. Is that the thing, right?
Yep.
And Mike Perry is now like the new hopeful at Jackson Wink. Maybe not the kind of fighter I would want to hang my Jim's fortunes on, if I'm being 100% honest. But there's certainly a drama behind this that makes it more compelling than just the style matchup itself. That being said, the style matchup is pretty interesting.
Yeah. I do like to imagine like the last few remaining members of Jackson Wink. Like on one side there's like John Jones and Mike Perry, and on the other side there's like Carlos Condit and Holly Holm just looking at each other like, hey, these guys seem not that nice. But anyway, yeah. So this one does seem to me like a how shot is Donald Cerrone fight.
Yeah.
Mike Perry is a pressure fighter of sorts, but he's still not a tremendously focused one. He's more someone who likes to come forward really than a pressure fighter.
Yeah.
And someone who likes to, I mean, he's an aggressive counterpuncher at heart, but he has no way of drawing out the counterpunches, I think. I think that's the real issue with his style. Meaning that he can get sort of made to bite on things from range repeatedly, as in the Max Griffin fight. And he's not a southpaw, which is something that has traditionally troubled Cerrone. I think we saw him struggle greatly against a much weaker striker a much lesser striker than Cerrone in Paul Felder. I don't think Paul Felder is as good as even a faded cowboy. Just getting a lot of like getting jabbed and worked from distance, and Felder is much more likely to try and step into the clinch, and he's much more instinctively steps in to grapple with people than Cerrone does. So I can see Perry getting to Cerrone early. I can see him hurting him. Cerrone has been, hit and hurt all the way through his career, and it's not getting any easier for him to take those shots. And Perry is a ferocious hitter, but stylistically it does feel like a Cerrone fight. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I've been banging this friggin' drum way too long, but at a certain point it has to become the right drum to bang, because I have been waiting for Donald Cerrone to hit like a real wall for years now, frankly. Like Pat and I were talking about this as a suspicion of ours, I think back when he fought like before he fought RDA the second time. We're like, man, at some point Cerrone's going to have to fall off. And it's been, of course, because he's Donald Cerrone, like 9 fights since then. And that was only 3 years ago or so. But at this point, like, it does feel like Cerrone is shakier than ever. I still don't really have a notion of what Mike Perry is going to add at Jackson Winklejohn. Like, if we have already compared him to Lando Venata and seen the myriad problems that Lando Venata has just run face first into over and over again, it seems like Mike Perry could end up in a very similar stagnant situation. We'll see. But does just being really aggressive, being able to survive better than a lot of the people that Cerrone fights, and just slinging big shots at the body and the head and chopping away at the legs, like, is it at the point where it's super powered aggressive fighter is enough to beat Cerrone? It doesn't feel like it just yet. Yeah, I think I tend to agree. Because at the very least, like, Leon Edwards neutralized and outsmarted, outcrafted, and outsped Donald Cerrone. These are all words that are very much real words. Mike Perry sure as hell isn't going to do that. Like, at the very least, one of the big improvements in Donald Cerrone's end has been his footwork. His movement has gotten dramatically better, I think, in the last few years, along with the move to welterweight. And Perry's, liking to come forward is a good way to describe his style of pressuring, because he's still not a tremendously consistent cage cutter. He's still not very quick of foot. He's a very plodding kind of fighter who has to plant his feet to throw and hurt you. So,
yeah. So I think one of the things about the Edwards fight is, A, obviously Edwards is a southpaw, and B, he's a straight and accurate puncher. And Cerrone's issues have always been when people can contest range with him and fight at the fight sort of box with him inside his kicking range. If someone has to blitz to close space against him, like Eddie Alvarez, he's happy as a pig in shit. He's just going to counter knee. He can look for the left hook, and he's just going to keep them on the end of his kicks. But Edwards was able to kind of body kick, jab, 1-2 cross, and so on, because he's about as tall as Cerrone is, and fights as long as him, but is just faster of foot.
Yeah,
and he was able to, and Cerrone had to step forward to come after him, and Cerrone doesn't particularly enjoy that. He just likes standing at the right range and just flinging kicks in. Perry can't really fight at range at all. Not really. He's just got his one weapon, which Cerrone probably has to look out for, is that weaving left hook.
Yeah.
That's his main range weapon, is that he'll try and draw something out and come under with that. But other than that, people who have done that kind of thing, people who have had to come in through level changes, Donald Cerrone has traditionally kind of beaten the shit out of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and has Perry's counterpunching actually gotten worse over time?
It kind of feels like it sometimes.
It might have, right? At the very least, he used to be uneducated enough about striking technique that he would just throw back when you were hitting him. And now it's like he's stuck between, where he's learned just enough technique that he knows he's supposed to do something about the strikes, but not enough to really put it all together and continue flowing. He had more flow when he was just relying on his athleticism, I think. So,
yeah. I mean, when Perry joined the UFC, everyone was like, there's going to be a point when this, we're laughing at this guy now. There's going to be a point where he's just going to come and absolutely dead one of your favorites.
Yeah.
And there's a solid chance that's going to be this time. Even, with all that we've said, Donald Cerrone is not a defensive mastermind.
Nope.
He's not even particularly durable anymore. There's a serious chance he's just going to get absolutely fucking knocked into we're going to see the Till fight again.
Yeah. But at the very least, I guess he's still working with Brandon Gibson, right? And Gibson has helped him add some new layers at welterweight in the last year or two. So, I mean, I assume he is. They're like buddies.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't think I'm not sure if he is. But even given that, I think he's simply a better striker than
yeah, that's the truth.
Mike Perry.
And we hardly even mentioned a good wrestler. It's very possible Cerrone takes Perry down. You may have said that before, in fact, but yeah, that's a possibility as well. So you still got to rely on a guy like Cerrone at this point. I agree. Do we want to talk about Benavidez Borg real quick? We may, in fact, end up putting some of this on a quick little bonus episode. I don't know. And in fact, we did. Look up Heavy Hands on Patreon. I don't know. It feels like I'll be rooting for him anyway. Shouts out to Ray Borg. Support him, by the way, huh? The man's selling t-shirts and shit because healthcare in this country is absolute dog shit, and his son is fighting for his life still. So support Ray Borg. Oh, Macy Barber's on this card too. It took me a minute to recognize her name. She had a super impressive debut, didn't she?
Give me 1 sec.
Look up Macy Barber, Phil. Pull that up, Jamie. She came in, she was like a young, 3-0 fighter. She's 20 years old, and she just housed...
Macy the Future Barber.
Yeah, who did she fight?
Jamie Colleen in a Tuesday Night Contender series.
Ah, that's right. So, she savaged her, man. She came in there. Colleen had won Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender series fight before. It was like a big puncher, and she just came in there and looked like a young female Rory McDonald. She just wrestled her. She smashed her on the ground. She beat her up in the clinch. She boxed her way in with a beautiful jab. Yeah, she's one to watch too. So just want to mention that before we wrap up. Macy Barber, women's.
You shouldn't have a name like The Future if your surname is a noun, though. I'm not accepting it because it just makes her sound like, when I'm done with this whole fighting thing, I'm going to be cutting some hair.
I do want to say that Barber versus Cyphers, it sounds like it could possibly be a World Star video as a fight, but it should be a good one to watch. So.
Macy, the future barber.
Okay, I get it now. It took me a minute. You had to say it. Hopefully nobody picks that nickname whose last name happens to be like, Garbage Man or anything like that. Okay, all right. I'm glad I was able to add new layers of hilarity to your already very good joke, Phil. Happy to help, as always. That's about it for us on this episode of Heavy Hands. Fun fights last weekend, fun fights ahead of us. Yeah, Macy Barber being on this card is even more exciting because she is a genuinely very exciting prospect in a division that I already always enjoy, women's strawweight. So that should be yet another thing to convince you to tune into this one. And we will be back next week. Of course, we've got like 7 straight weeks of UFC now following 230. So next week, not only will we be recapping the results of UFC Fight Night Denver, we'll also be previewing Neil Magny versus Santiago Ponzinibbio, Ricardo Lamas versus Darren Elkins. Shit, I don't know, Cynthia Calvillo versus Poliana Botelho. There's some good stuff on this.
Bahia Breeze.
Oh, of course. Boy. A middleweight fight to end all middleweight fights. So we'll be back to talk about that next week. Until then, Phil, I assume you have at least a preview of some sort coming out this week.
Yep. I think we're only going to be hitting the main card for this one. I'll have to check my schedule, but we've definitely got one coming out for, Chan Sung Jung versus Yair Rodriguez, so keep your eye out for that.
Nice. As for me, I'm working on a piece on Lando Venata. I don't know if it's the title I'll be running with, but the driving premise is why can't Lando Venata avoid getting into wars? I'm going to look at all the factors, both technical and promotional, that I think have gone into the now lose. Let's see, here's UFC record by memory: lose, win, lose, draw, which is not what you would want out of an exciting action prospect. So look forward to that. And until next week, thank you all so much for tuning in. Find us on that social media at Boxing Bush, BUSCH. That's me on Twitter. And of course, you can find Phil at Evil Greg Jackson. And all those pieces of writing we mentioned coming out this week, you'll find those on bloodyelbow.com. Check out our Patreon, yada, yada, yada. We'll talk to you guys next week. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands. Alrighty, my friend. Good ep. That felt good.
Yeah, I think it was. There were fun fights and stuff to preview.
All right.
We didn't even mention fucking the thrill a minute that's going to be Mayweather tension.
Oh Jesus! Somehow I just saw that announcement for the first time like an hour before we recorded and just wiped it from my mind.
Yeah. That's because it is dumb.
Yeah, it is. It's dumb.